we'll stay on the tomato train here. We have some questions about blight. Mary Kathleen and Barry Wilkinson want to know. They say our area has suffered an exposure to tomato blight more than 5 years ago. I've been able to grow cherry and plum tomatoes, even tomatillos, but any full size tomato turns black before it ripens. What can we do to pick healthy beefsteaks again?
That sounds like late blight to me. Without seeing it, I can't really confirm it. But it's interesting that Roma tomatoes or paste tomatoes and some cherry tomatoes are resistant to it. So yeah, it makes sense that it's not showing any symptoms on those types of tomatoes. So I mean, on the slicing tomatoes, the beefsteak tomatoes, the real strategy for late blight is to just make sure you do everything that's we recommend for growing tomatoes. The mulching, the staking, the pruning, um, and making sure there's good airflow around the plants. So not planting the plants too close together. I would not plant a beefsteak tomato closer than 36 inches apart. So if they're trying to crowd the plants, it'll probably promote this disease problem. Late blight is something that shows up when it gets warm and wet. So it's not something that we'll see immediately here. We have more problem with early blight and septoria leaf spot than we do late blight usually. So normally our pathologist, our West Virginia University Extension pathologist, Dr. Rahman, will send out pest alerts for late blight as it moves across the state, because it moves from other areas into West Virginia. So when that alert goes out, gardeners can respond by applying even organic pesticides such as copper, liquid copper, for helping to control it. There's some other organic products that are labeled for it as well that gardeners can use. But the main thing I think is not give up. Late blight doesn't always show up. So sometimes it'll show up, sometimes you won't see it for a couple of years. But just be prepared that when the alert goes out from the Extension Service, that you take action and maybe do some spraying to control the disease. It's a fungal disease that needs warm, wet weather to grow. There are some varieties of tomatoes that are resistant to late blight or tolerant to late blight. The Mountaineer Pride, which is released from WVU last year or the year before last, I should say, has resistance to late blight. So it's a version of the Centennial tomato, which was released in 1963 by Dr. Gallagly. And so if somebody's seeking a variety that has resistance to septoria leaf spot and some resistance to early blight, but has pretty darn good resistance to late blight, that would be a Mountaineer Pride would be a good variety to choose for West Virginia.
We have a lot of folks in our program who are gardening for the first time this year. Can you talk just a little bit about what blight is and maybe explain the difference between that early blight that you mentioned and the late blight?
Yeah, it's sort of depressing sometimes when you grow tomatoes. You try to do everything right, grow a good plant, and then sometimes you get just wiped out by a disease such as blight, and it's not really anybody's fault. I mean, it's just it's just a natural occurrence. So I mean, here in West Virginia, as you mentioned, Zach, we have 3 types of blights that are mostly attack tomatoes: or early blight, late blight, and septoria leaf spot. And I would bet you would see one of those in every county in West Virginia during the growing season. I mean, we see areas of the state that have more septoria leaf spot than they do early blight, and vice versa. But I think it's just a multiple approach to dealing with these diseases. I mean, sometimes you can use genetic resistance, as I mentioned earlier with the Mountaineer Pride, but I think it's just good gardening practices. I mean, I would not grow a tomato if I couldn't stake it. You can stake it with a individual stake, or you can do a cage, or you can tie them to a woven wire fence or a cattle panel or whatever you want to do. But tomatoes need to be off the ground to keep them from getting disease issues. Because early blight particularly, and septoria leaf spot, will come from the soil, the rain splashed soil up on the leaves. So any way you can buffer the plant from that exposure to soil either by mulching it and getting it off the ground, it's going to definitely help. And anything to improve airflow around the plant, as I mentioned earlier, increasing the distance, the in-row distance between plants is going to help. And pruning the plants. If I was growing an old-time variety of tomato, an heirloom variety, or even some of the hybrids that are fairly big plants, you want to prune, or what's called suckering the tomatoes. That's done before flowering or right at the first flowering. And that helps manage the amount of leaves that the plant grows and helps the plant dry out between rains and heavy dews, so it doesn't trigger these diseases. So these diseases are fungal diseases that, they need water to be activated. So they need wet leaves. So, if you have a lot of rain, you're going to have issues with them. If you overhead water with a garden hose, you're going to trigger these disease problems. So it's best to water bottom water, have a soaker hose or a drip irrigation kit in the garden that just waters the root system, not the leaves. Because everybody who has problems with these diseases tends to have a lot of wet leaves all the time. So if you don't want to, if the gardener doesn't want to use, soaker hoses, then if they're going to water, they should water in the morning and let the plant dry out enough before night. If they water in the evening, plant's going to stay wet all night, and it's going to trigger that disease issue. But the good news is, these diseases are manageable. It's just, important to catch the symptoms early. And if the gardener doesn't know the symptom immediately, our pathologist, Dr. Ram, is excellent at diagnostics. So going directly to the county agent in your county, maybe sending a picture or just a real good description of what you're seeing. And then our diagnostic team will diagnose it and give you the solutions to correcting it before it gets out of control. That's the main thing. Catch it early before it gets wipes out the garden, or wipes out every plant in the garden that's infected. Because early blight, and some of these other diseases attack other plants too. They attack other than tomatoes, so they have a lot of hosts that they attack. So catching it before it gets widespread is really important.